Shalom. This week we are reading the double portions of Acharei Mot-Kedoshim, Parashat Acharei Mot, beginning in Sefer Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, chapter 16, and Parashat Kedoshim, beginning in chapter 19. You know, Parashat Kedoshim really begins with what I would have to call a call to holiness. We read, God spoke to Moshe saying, "Speak to the entire assembly of the children of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, HaShem, your God, am holy." So this is a call to every man, woman, and child to be holy. And this command was issued in a very public gathering. It's called in Hakel. And God emphasizes here, speak to the entire assembly of the children of Israel. So we learn that everyone was gathered together to hear these words. No one was absent. One of the reasons for this is because, as our sages tell us, the majority of the principles of the Torah are included in this portion of Parashat Kedoshim. And these principles of the Torah are really dependent on this idea of holiness. And the simple level of interpretation really is that there's so much here that actually the Ten Commandments themselves are really alluded to in the precepts in Parashat Kedoshim as well, that it's such a central concept, but also on a deeper level, what we're talking about here, this call to holiness and what's being presented to us in Parashat Kedoshim is really itself the main thrust of the experience of the Torah. And we find that the stress here is on our relationship with God on the one hand. This holiness seems to stress the relationship. It's the calling, the prerequisite of the Jewish nation to be holy. But as it's already been asked, how are we supposed to be like God, who has no end? And we've already been taught that that means, this concept of holiness, to be separate, to be apart. As we were told already in the book of Exodus, we are called upon to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. We find that the majority of the principles here in Parashat Kedoshim are not really focusing on aspects of our relationship with God, but actually details that pertain to man and his fellow man, society. There are aspects of faith as well, and aspects of chok, like forbidden mixtures, but also included here are ideas like gifts to the poor, honest weights and measures, honest business dealings, loving one's fellow, forbidden relationships, kashrut, all sorts of different ideas. And what we see is that the call to holiness really applies to every aspect of our lives in this world. And this in itself is a very deep idea, because one might think the idea of holiness is very abstract. Okay, we're called upon to be separate, to be removed. So maybe we have to be removed altogether from this world. But actually what we see here from Parashat Kedoshim is that the call to holiness is about emulating God while being indeed very firmly rooted in this world. Not by being on some sort of spiritual kind of trip, not by playing any sort of mind game with ourselves and thinking that maybe we're something that we're not, but by how we actually live as physical beings in this world. But there's another idea that really is one of the underpinnings of this idea of holiness that's taught to us in this parasha, and that's the idea of what our sages call sanctifying oneself by even that which is permitted to you, by going an extra measure, by going an extra distance, and by setting up safeguards within one's lifestyle, and maybe holding back even in areas that are permitted so that our lifestyle is a little bit more limited. And actually, this is a theme that runs through the Parsha, but we realize that on three separate occasions here in Parashat Kedoshim, we see this call to holiness. The first time is in the very beginning of the portion. As we read, God said to Moshe, spoke to Moshe saying, "Speak to the entire assembly of the children of Israel and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, HaShem, your God, am holy." And we have been taught that this first call to holiness in the Parsha is essentially referring to aspects of sexual purity. That one has to be on guard against sin and go to an extra level, even of that which is permitted. A person should not become a wanton person, gluttonous person, should not become miscreant, what the Ramban calls a scoundrel with the Torah's permission. A person could act in a certain lifestyle and say, well, everything is permitted, these things are permitted, it's okay. A person has to sanctify oneself even in things that are permitted. The second time that we see this call to holiness is when the Torah is talking about the idolatrous cult of Molech, of child sacrifice, and it goes on to speak about various forms of sorcery. And here, the verses are alluding to the aspect of avodah zarah, of idolatry, and this is a call for holiness in our faith. Also, there are levels upon levels of faith that need to be strengthened. The third time that we find this call to holiness is in relation to the laws of kashrut, holiness and kashrut, the dietary laws. We find, the verse tells us in verse 25, you shall distinguish between the clean animal and the unclean, and between the clean bird and the unclean, and you shall not render your souls abominable through such animals and birds, and through anything that creeps on the ground, which I have set apart for you to render unclean. You shall be holy for me, for I am HaShem, for I, HaShem, am holy, and I have separated you from the peoples to be mine. And so here we find that even in matters of our physical survival, our physical essence, it's not just a question of not eating what's forbidden, it's a question of even those things that are permitted to us for us to eat them in a permitted way. Everything has to be in holiness, we see. The heart, the mind, the stomach, from head to toe, we have a call for an aspect of our lives to be holy, meaning to be expecting from ourselves something extra, to go the distance, to go an extra measure. Another interesting thing that we find about this whole concept of holiness is the fact that this call was issued to the entire assembly. No one was missing, the entire nation. Today we have people who say, this is all too much for me, this doesn't apply to me, this applies to other people and in another time. But certainly this can't be an expectation of every human being. Whereas the Torah is really teaching, HaShem is speaking to every single Jew, telling us, no, this is really what I expect from every single man, woman, and child. And at the same time, another very beautiful thing that we realize, that we understand from this concept of the entire assembly of Israel hearing these words together, is that this is a national goal, that there is strength in the numbers of Israel, that this is a state which is required of us, and that God is seeking for us not only on the individual level, but on the level of the entire nation, and that together we can bring about this level of holiness for the entire nation of Israel. So this concept of holiness is about being separate, but not about being removed from the world. And as we're going to learn, the Nazirite, for example, who takes a vow of abstinence from wine at the conclusion of his period of abstention, has to bring a sin offering because of the fact that he separated himself from the world. Because being separate doesn't mean to hold ourselves away from the world. It means to be a part of this world, but to sanctify it and to bring holiness to every aspect of our lives in this world.